Well, welcome to this lecture. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about some of the structures in the desert. We're going to have a number of lectures covering various structures and as the old timers would call, the lay of the land. It's a very important thing to understand the lay of the land. And we're going to, of course, try to understand it from a personal, individual level and not from some overly in-depth scientific method, but rather how does this affect me, so to speak. And what we're going to be talking about today in this structure, in this particular aspect of the desert, is a confluent, or a place where two different washes come together, and not rivers, but actually dry washes, and try to understand their significance in the desert. And they are often significant places in the desert, and we have to understand them to understand the broader desert. These places can affect the desert for miles around. So with that, let's start working our structure here. Let's say this is our wash, and we'll say, I don't know, it's a mile long. Say it's a mile long, 1 mile long. And we have coming in another wash coming in this way, ties in. And we'll say that it's about a half mile long. Now, one of the basic needs of this structure is that when it were to rain, especially in a flash flood, of course, if we look at this and say this is 100% water going down this wash and 100% going down this, down here, this wash has to be structured, if you will. Of course, nature takes care of this, to be 200% in its capacity. And basically what that means is normally it's wider. And so when we get a rainstorm, let's say here, and we get water coming down, what's going to happen here is when it gets to this point, the wash is going to be wider. As it gets wider, the same amount of water, let's say it's a foot deep, and now it's going to be 6 inches deep. Why? Because this down below this confluent, it's wider. So as soon as it does that, rocks and debris that were flowing down there in 1 foot of water suddenly only have 6 inches of water to work with, and they're going to stop right there. Now, this is going to be the same when this one runs. And let's say once a century or 2 or 3 times a century, we get a situation where there's a cloud burst over here in this mountain range. All of this will get water from that flash flood, and then it's going to hit this wider section and slow down, and then the water will go down this way. And let's say a month later, let's say this is in June, and then in August, this mountain range, it's the same. Now, all of this will get water, then it'll hit here, and then it'll slow down because it's going to go into a wider wash. Well, everything here has been watered once. Everything here has been watered once. But right here, it got water twice. Got water twice from here on down. However, the water as it came down here had velocity that's dropped rocks and stuff and has kind of made like a baffle sometimes. And it's the first place where rocks and trees, and a lot of times when you get a wash like this, it'll actually wash out a section. And if we were to draw that, it might actually, this might actually be a bow in the flatter area. So actually, rather than being at 200%, this might actually be right at this confluent, maybe 210, 220% of the width, if you will, just to use kind of a soft number. But in any case, it's eroded out and it's a wider, flatter place. And it's flatter, which is another thing, because as these rocks and boulders pile up, if you were looking at this from an edgewise, you'd see this slope like this. That would be one of these or these, and then the confluent would be flatter, and then after the confluent it would pick up. Now, because it's flatter and it's got the bigger rocks and the bigger gravel, because it's getting wider at this spot, this area is a coarser material. And as a coarser material, anybody that's ever taken like a bucket of water, you can just pour it into some of these sand washes, and that water will just pour literally right into the earth. When you get done emptying the bucket, there's nothing there. Well, what that means in a thunderstorm is that when water comes down through here, levels out, it's got rocks, it's got trees, suddenly it's slowed down. It might only be a few seconds, but a few seconds of pouring water into that gravel, a lot of water is going to go deep into this ground, a lot of water. Oftentimes below the confluent, you can often see that there's been less water, that it's really soaked up a lot of water out of that wash, because it's got that coarse, deep gravel and rocks, and the water hits these trees that have grown. They grow up out of this because there's all this deep moisture here, and you get trees which then push the water out wider and slow it down a little bit more. And again, it's just kind of a feeding on itself, this confluent. Now this condition of a rain here and a rain there may only happen, like I say, once a decade, 2-3 times a century. But if you got trees like your desert willow, your smoke trees and stuff like that, they live 100 years or more. Your mesquite can live a long time. So 3 times in a century is enough that on that double hit, everything here died. All your smoke trees, they sprouted and died. Sprouted and died, or even most of them. 95% dead, 95% died any given year that you had a thunderstorm. But here, because it once or twice or 3 times a century, they get water. It's enough for them to grow faster, bigger, and more abundant. And once you begin to walk the desert and start looking for this situation, you'll begin to see it. And it's often a mini oasis where birds and bighorn sheep and all sorts of wildlife, coyotes and rabbits, all utilize this little confluent. Now, another thing to consider that happens is, let's call this Black Mountain. Now, Black Mountain might be a basaltic lava mountain, and it's running all its debris off into this wash. And if this mountain, we'll call it Red Mountain, maybe it's a sandstone or a limestone or something, it's running its debris down this wash. Well, right here, those 2 different types of material are mixing. And when they mix, you almost always get a soil that's better for life, better for plant life, to start and grow in a wider range of plant life. You might find, like if this is a limestone, it might be a very narrow plant community on it. But when this limestone is now mixed with this lava, a wider amount of plants, a wider diversity of plants is able to grow. And with that wider and more fertile soil, wider plant community, more fertile soil, of course you get your animals that would eat it, whether it's a bird or a lizard or you know, and then the predators come in on top of that as far as population. Now, I use this particular scale of 1 mile to a half mile because it's often a very easy size when you're walking the desert to see and to see its intensity. But this phenomena, as we'll discuss in other lectures, can scale up or down. But it'll suffice to say that, let's say along here we have a small little canyon, let's say 15-20 yards. Now what that would look like a little closer up, let's say this is the main wash. Now this main wash, and the flow is in this direction, really only runs when there's thunderstorms. It's huge, it's sandy, it really needs a cloudburst to really see this thing run. But we have a little confluent, if you will, a little intersection with this smaller wash, only 20-30 yards long, and it's dumping into the main wash. And you think, well, it'd be relatively insignificant. Well, let's think about it for a moment. If we have a bush right here, and we have another one right about here, anytime you get a thunderstorm, both of those plants will get a nice drink of water. But then later in the year, let's say in the winter, in the desert we often get these soft rains. It might rain an inch in say 6 hours. Just a nice constant drizzle. The wash here then will be moistened down to maybe 2 or 3 inches of moist earth out of that 1 inch of drizzle for 6 hours. But over here, on this little one, and here we might have, to make it, we might have a 2% grade. This is maybe a 45-degree angle, this little one here. So after about 4 hours of constant soft drizzle, this starts to run just a little bit, and it's mostly because it's steep. It's relatively steep, being a 45-degree angle, but it's just a small trickle. If you were walking in that rainstorm, that you probably wouldn't even notice it, but it's just a little pencil stream of water just pouring, maybe a gallon a minute. Doesn't seem like much, but a gallon a minute after 4 hours, that means there's 2 hours left of rain. So that's 120 gallons of water that's going to be dumped right in here for this bush to work off of. Well, next year, guess which plant's going to be in better shape? Yeah, this one had 120 gallons dumped on it. Now, another way to look at this, because if you remember, we had different soils mixing. But you might say, well, this is back up fairly close to the mountain, and this is alluvial debris. It doesn't seem like there's much change. But actually, if you were to look at, this would be the surface of the wash, and this would be a cliff face with a little cut in it. There's all kinds of strata, thousands of years of this wash laid down on this strata. And it's had plants growing in it, and it's had water percolating through it, and ages and ages of just root systems rotting in it, and freezing and breaking, and all kinds of weathering, and then another layer comes in, and then that gets weathered, and plants grow on, and another layer. Now it's getting cut, and it's essentially the same material, although it's had more time to decay, more time to change, ever so slightly. So the plant that's right here at the base actually is getting a slightly different mixture of soil and dirt than its counterpart further out in the wash, even though the base material is pretty much the same. So when you start looking at these subtleties and start to understand these kind of structures, you'll begin to understand then, of course, the plants, how the plants are related to the very geology of the desert. And of course, if the plants are reacting to that, then so are the animals that eat the plants, and the animals that eat the animals that eat the plants, and so on. And so we have in this a fairly easy structure to find in the desert, a fairly common one, and one that you should try to seek out and try to understand in its full array of how it kind of shows up: steep slopes, stuff that's not steep, and so on. And with that, I thank you and hope you enjoyed this lecture.